Professor Boucher, thank you so very much for joining our interview series.
It's a pleasure.
Let me start right away with the first question.
Sure.
How does the ideational approach to populism help us understand the continuity between Trump's first and second administrations in shaping foreign policy through anti-elitist and pro-people rhetoric?
I think this is a great question because it goes through, it touches directly kind of the debate we have in populism, right? Between discursive approach to populism and ideational approach to populism. What I really like about the ideational approach to populism is that it really ties beliefs and values with behaviors, right? So the assumption is it's not only that populist leaders or populists who like or voters will think about these terms, about anti-elitism, about pro people, but will also behave in such a way. So we're expecting essentially that people will talk as populists, but will also behave as populists. So as soon as you kind of approach this from an ideational perspective, what you really think is that these people really believes in these values and these, in these hierarchies of beliefs, and they'll start to act upon it. And this is why I really like the ideational approach for the foreign policy, because the argument is that not only does Trump have some sort of populist ideology that is tin-centered, but he also kind of puts in place policies that try to achieve these things and tries to kind of attack the anti-elites and kind of create pro-people argument. And that really kind of transpired not only into like domestic politics, but also in foreign policy politics. When you're adopting a discursive approach, it's harder to kind of explain why a populist kind of would move between sectors of policies. But when they have a ideology, the assumption that these ideology beliefs have this kind of far-reaching kind of intersection with different kinds of sectors in economics, in immigration, and in this case, in foreign policy. So I really believe that that allows us to kind of explain a little bit better how there's consistency across the Trump administration's policies. So on foreign policy, for example, in the first Trump administration, there were a couple of foreign policy decisions that were really tied to that populist views. For example, there was all this argument about tariffs, and that we've seen in the first Trump administration, but there are also arguments about immigration. Remember the travel ban and anti-Muslim policies that were tried to put in place, and you could see how like populism and ethno-nationalism was kind of centered around those policies. And we're seeing this again in Trump 2.0, and I think that's important to kind of understand.
Right. You have written about populism's impact on foreign policy coherence. In the current environment, can foreign policy institutions remain resilient under populist leadership, or do they inevitably erode?
When you sent me that question, I really thought about it, and I'm still kind of debating in my head. I think there's a lot of research that I think is interesting in populism on how populist leaders go after institutions and try to kind of really change the institutions and disaggregate them, so that a lot of the power center comes back toward the populist leaders and less around these institutions. I think on foreign policy, we're seeing the same thing, especially in the Trump 2.0. So the first Trump administration, the foreign policy institutions, the State Department, the Department of Defense, even the Department of Homeland Security, were roughly able to kind of control and maintain their integrity in the Trump administration. And a lot of the adults in the room at that time were that kind of national security, national defense, foreign policy environment. When you look and when we read Project 2025, a lot of the post-Trump, the Trump administration misgiving about what happened during the first administration was really that a lot of these foreign policy institutions had kind of resisted the Trump's questions or Trump's policies. If you look now in Trump 2.0, a big chunk of Trump's push is around these institutions. Internally, the State Department, the Department of Defense, the Department of Homeland Security, even the NSA are getting all their institutions disaggregated. There's all this push against the elites, and there's a lot of push toward loyalists. At the international level, Trump is also doing the same thing, taking the U.S. out of the WHO, having misgivings on the G20, on the G7, and really kind of also kind of pulling himself out or trying to undermine the institutions at the international level that could put a stop or could put like a control over his policy decisions. What I find interesting is that he uses the same kind of discourses to explain why he's doing the things he's doing at the domestic level and why he's doing it at the international level. And when you hear what he says, he's going to say, make a lot of argument about how the elites are controlling those institutions, that somehow they are contravening or not representing the will of the people, and somehow we have to undo them to so that the voice of the people get heard. And you see the same thing at the international level, where it's going to say the globalists and the internationalists are controlling those institutions, and that's the reason why the United States has to kind of put Americans, the American people first, and somehow kind of take away those institutions and the control of those institutions on foreign policy.
Right. How has the Trump administration weaponized populist narratives that portray global trade regimes as elite conspiracies to justify protectionism?
This is a question I'm asking myself all the time. I think it really, from an ideational perspective, it's not just about weaponization. My question always in my head is that, are populists really believe what they say, or is it just kind of a way to frame their issues? And if you take an ideational approach, you'll say like these populists kind of believe that that's true. And Trump has been very consistent across his career on thinking that tariffs were like a good way and a good policy. And much of the argument was that outside actors and the elites were essentially taking over American policies, and somehow we're abusing the American people unfairly, and kind of like transcribing this kind of anti-elite argument that we see in the domestic environment into the international level, and saying, well, all of these countries in the world and all of these globalists are creating this network that are abusive to the United States, and that somehow they have removed the capacity of Americans to make their own policies and to decide for themselves. That somehow the American people lost agency, and really kind of use this kind of language to kind of articulate a protectionist policy that really frames the outside actors as these abusive and corrupt institutions and countries and people, and that somehow the American president, Trump, the populist leader, really tries to fight this and kind of reclaims these powers for the American people. So the way I kind of see this is that you essentially move from the Manichaean view of populism from the anti-elite and people to the international level. Well, the people becomes the American people, and the elites are kind of these outside actors that are corrupt and abusing the American people, and kind of the same kind of framework of a divided world between the corrupted and the pure people that are, disenfranchised and dispowered by those elites.
Right. Your chapter in a recently published book highlights the role of nativist securitization in justifying the travel ban. In today's context, how might similar nativist framing be deployed in foreign policy debates, such as immigration from conflict zones or relations with globalist institutions?
I think one of the things that paper was written a long time ago, and it's kind of ironic that it took so long to get published, and now it gets published, and we see the same kind of policies on nativism and immigration being reenacted. And it's depressing to see that somehow we were kind of in a great way. I think in that, like, really the argument in that paper was that on immigration issues, you could see how like ethno-nationalism and populism were kind of structured in the same way and created a framework of outside and inside actors, which are central to ethno-nationalism. And I thought at that time that it was kind of an interesting way to frame those issues in the populist. And other people have written a lot on populism and far right populism and really kind of ethno-nationalism. In this context, what we were seeing is that the way Trump was kind of framing immigration issues was really kind of centered around this argument about the elites and the people being this kind of ethno-nationalist pure people, and creating a like an outside inside actor dynamic that was kind of interesting in that policy, and kind of frames a lot of the way they think about those issues. And that's how we kind of saw that argument.
In the light of increasing overlap between populism and foreign policy, do you foresee a lasting structural transformation of US foreign policy priorities away from multilateralism and toward identity-driven narratives of national sovereignty and civilizational conflict?
I do. I think so. I'm a Canadian, and of course, we're really, really close to the Americans, and so we've been kind of seeing a lot of what's happening. And as you well know, we're bearing the brunt of a lot of, the United States abuse at this time. Being called like the 51st states and kind of claims about our sovereignty. What we see from our perspective, from the Canadian perspective, and I think that it's the same thing that I would say for the populist perspective, is that on two fronts. On the one hand, sometimes we mistake the leader for the movement, and we somehow kind of think that Trump and the populist leader is kind of the architect of everything. And I think that's a mistake. What we see in the American people right now is there's an appetite for populist discourse at the people's level, at the demand level, and that Trump is just an embodiment of that kind of pressure. A lot of people within the American institutions and amongst Americans' elite hold populist ideas and really are at that point. So even if we got rid of Trump, we would still have this kind of movement being part of the conversation in the United States, and I don't think it would change fundamentally what's happening in the U.S. So I think Trump is just a symptom. There's a broader movement that supports the way he behaves, and which explains why the pushback against the Trump, undoing of institutions isn't as strong as you might think, and there's a lot more support for that. The second part would be that systematically right now, the Trump administration is going after the foreign policy establishments and institutions in the US, State Department, DOD, DHS, and you can see at all levels that there's a kind of deep dive into those institutions and unrooting a lot of those programs and a lot of those check and balances that were put in place. It's not just about US aid. It's if you look at what the Department of Defense is doing on DEI, on all those kinds of issues, there's really a deep reconstruction of those institutions. So as Trump will move away, maybe in 2023, those institutions will be very, 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 very different than what he was when he came in. And I think it's gonna take time, or somehow it's gonna stay in place. So not only is there an appetite for what Trump wants, but the institutions that were safeguard against those appetite won't be there anymore. And you'll be faced with really different institutions that will have, will make it easier for a populist leader to kind of produce a foreign policy that is a lot more centered around itself, that is more nativist and is more protectionist. And I think that's the future that we're going to see in the next couple of years.
Given your findings on the use of social media to propagate populist foreign policy, how do you assess the evolution of this communication strategy in Trump's second term, especially with shifting media platforms and increasing polarization?
I think it's part of the argument. There's a lot of good research on why populist leaders prefer social media or alternative media as a way to communicate with the people. There's a lot of arguments. One is, on the one hand, that those mainstream media are portrayed as those of the elites, and somehow populist leaders have kind of a deep seated like obsession about that. But social media also allows the populist leader to have a direct connection with the people and kind of talk to people specifically. And if you see in what the Trump administration is doing, there's a lot of that. In the Trump 1.0, there was all these attacks on mainstream media, on fake news, and all of those were constant. And we see it in our data on tariffs, but even on nativism. A lot of the anti-elite discourse is direct from Trump and from the people, is directed around against those media institutions that seems to be representing the elites. What I find interesting right now in the Trump 2.0 is that Trump is actually going after directly those institutions. You've seen, for example, how they're suing CBS and all those kinds of institutions, taking away NPR, and really going after a lot of those power centers of the mainstream media. You also saw how he's allowing a lot of these alternative medias to come to press releases and press conferences, and kind of allowing those alternative media to have a larger impact. Finally, we see that the Trump administration, like the Trump 1.0, really communicates a lot of his ideas and argument on social media. On tariffs, for example, policy officials actually learn about new directions of tariff policies through Trump's tweeting on Truth Social or going on X, and social media becomes like a really strong way for him to do this. It also allows the populist leader to sidestep all the check and balances of institutions, but also internally, where what he can say and how he addresses himself is unrestrained by all of those actors. And I think that really makes it an important part of that conversation.
Right. You demonstrate that populist narratives were reinforced by networks of actors beyond political elites, including media and think tanks. How do you see these networks evolving under renewed populist leadership, and what new actors have emerged in this space since 2017?
I think this is one of the things that we want. Like, the more I think about how we wrote about those issues in that time, kind of is really around this. The argument was that a lot of the literature focuses on populist leaders and forgets that there is actually a lot of contribution and a broader network that supports that leader. That, in fact, if you think of a populist movement, you have to look at all of those actors that supports the leader. And somehow, it's very hard for a populist leader to be alone in that space, and there's a lot of other actors. In that case, we kind of found out when we were looking at social media networks and influencers, is that of course, the populist leader was the most influential actor in that network, but he had a bunch of other groups, advocacy groups, a think tank that were kind of supporting those environment. Today, you see exactly the same thing, and not only do you see the same things, that some of those actors now are part of the Trump administration. For example, Project 2025, which was kind of at the center of a think tank, kind of producing a lot of populist ideas about how to transform government in a possible Trump 2.0 administration, is now part of the administration, and they're really at the center of this. People like Elon Musk and the tech bros were also kind of really pushing populist ideas on social media, and were essential part of the re-election of Trump 2.0, and are now part of the government, kind of creating and helping the president puts in place his agenda. Some of the people, Jack Posobiec, and all of those far-right networks that were part of the election and ecosystem around Trump and the MAGA movement, are now in government or close to the administration. So when we think about the Trump administration, we should stop believing that Trump is the only actor. There's actually an ecosystem that was built around the MAGA movement that was sort of nascent in the Trump 1.0 that now is really kind of institutionalized in Trump 2.0, and that's moving up in that environment. What I saw in 2017 was 16 and 17 was really kind of this loose ecosystem. And I think the last 4 years really kind of crystallized that network into a proper movement with, influencers, money, and institutions and architecture that now is really kind of the base of the MAGA movement is a lot more formalized. I think the last part is that I think the reason why the Trump administration right now is able to move faster on his agenda and faster to push its populist ideas into the system is because of the support of all of those actors, right? He wouldn't be able to do everything he's doing without Elon Musk and Doge coming in. He wouldn't be able to do this without Mike Johnson controlling Congress. And so a lot of those actors that were kind of loosely connected to him in 2016, 2020 are now really kind of part of his group and pushes his agenda moving forward, and of course makes it move way faster and more deeper in the institutions than it used to be.
Right. How have Trump's populist politics redefined the symbolic value of tariffs, not merely as economic tools, but as performative instruments of sovereignty and resistance against the globalist elite?
I think this is where the populist argument comes in, right? Where you mix the economics of it with the politics and belief system of it, right? And you can see in the US, there's right now in the conversation around tariffs, there's kind of these two conversations that are going at the same time. You have the economist conversation, where a lot of economists are trying to explain why tariffs is a good thing for the US and trying to put in place. I'm less interested in that because it seems to me that all the data goes against that argument. That the argument that the tariffs are a good thing is a marginal group. What I think is interesting and more conducive to explaining what's happening is really this kind of belief system. In the end, Trump really believes that tariffs will undo the power of the elites, will recreate this structure of economics, refocusing on the good of the American people, and somehow that's the way it should be. And the interesting part is you can hear it when he talks is that he recognizes that this will have deep economic impact, right? He says this will be difficult, this will produce pain, but this is a good thing for the American people. We're going to bring back real jobs for real Americans, for workers, and despite the economic pain and the this is not really an economic argument. This is a political and populist argument that explains why we should do this. And when you listen to his political argument of why we should do this, it makes a lot more sense than if you're looking at the economic. I also think that that's the reason why trying to argue with the Trump movement on economic terms makes no difference, because in their head, it's not an economic argument. It's a political belief system that they're trying to push in place. And they really don't care if, some of the economic pains are produced in that environment. What they're looking for is really kind of recenter the economic power around the American people and not on what they think are the elites and the people in the cities that are benefiting from a global international system.
Right. You argue that foreign policy is increasingly shaped by emotional and identity-based appeals. To what extent do you see populist trade wars as cultural projects, not just economic or strategic ones? Are we now seeing what you anticipated, the normalization of tariffs as political theater rather than as policy tools grounded in economic rationale?
Right. So remember, we wrote this paper in 2017, 2018. So it was a long time ago. What I really concern is that we're like, I was hoping that we would be a lot like wrong, or it would be kind of a moment. But I think today it's becoming more and more about that. Um, and it's not just in the Trump administration. You're seeing a lot of those argument around how trade and protectionism is becoming um, an a formalization of the will of the people. And I think this is the important part. One of the argument that we're seeing in the populist movement is that global trade networks really kind of remove the center of power from the people to these elites, these bankers, the traders that were able to kind of control global markets, but really the people were kind of left behind in that environment. And of course, they were characterizing these people, these Davos and World Economic Forum people, as these corrupt elites that are controlling the international economic system. What I find interesting is that, and this is why I think it's an ideology more so than just a discourse, is that most populist leaders from the left and the right have the same discourse. From Marine Le Pen in France to Nigel Farage in the UK to Orban in Hungary, you're seeing the same kind of argument that we have to take away the power away from the globalists, create protectionist policies that will protect the people, and we have to kind of disengage from this network of economic relations. And I believe that right now we're in that phase, right? That really we're going to see a retrenchment from global politics. We're going to see a refocusing on trying to create national manufacturing and supply side arguments, and you're going to be the trade will be more sticky, and there's going to be more friction in international trade than what we used to. What I find interesting, last point, is that even without Trump, when we were listening to the Biden administration, there was also a lot of argument about supply chain management and supply chain security, and really kind of bringing back a lot of those manufacturing jobs and a lot of those capacity to control the national economic life of countries. So even without Trump, you still have this kind of retrenchment from really loose international trade, and really kind of focusing on domestic politics and domestic economics.
Right. Drawing on your tariff analysis, how has Trump's second term intensified the personalization and performative use of trade policy? In what ways does this reflect broader populist tendencies that reject institutional expertise and multilateralism while mobilizing domestic political support?
From an ideational perspective, you believe that populism and this kind of Manichaean view of the world structures how people think, and how people behave. So what we're seeing in the trade environment is exactly that. That tariffs become this kind of tool for them to put in place a populist structure where through tariffs you essentially allow the institutions that were built to kind of disaggregate themselves. You take away power from the elites that are controlling those international networks, and you're trying to refocus those economic forces into the people. Somehow I have a how in the populist literature there's always this argument between, is populism a disease of democratic system or a solution, right? A correction of lack of representation in economic system. And I really think that the way a lot of the populists think about these tariffs is this way, is that it's a corrective to unbridled trade negotiations that took away economic power from the people and put into the hands of the elites, of people in cities, in the service industry that were able to kind of live a good life while workers were, less and less powerful. And so retaking that power into the people becomes this tool. I don't think it's just performative. Somehow I think they really believe that somehow it will recenter the power on the people, that will recreate a manufacturing base. In some ways, when you listen to how economists are talking about this, what it will do in the US is essentially all the service industries that were in the cities will have a harder time to, trade and benefit from the economics, and we're going to recenter this around, manufacturing. If it happens, you're going to see a lot less power in the cities and the elites and the traders, and a lot more power, economic power in middle America and in the manufacturing base that produces a lot more people. Personally, I don't think it's going to work out this way. I think automation and a lot of other things have contributed to the erosion of the manufacturing sector in the US, but for sure from a populist perspective, their argument is that we've exported these jobs abroad. The elites in the cities benefited from that kind of trade networks and really freeing of trade, and the people suffered from it. And by putting in place tariffs, we're gonna cut those networks, and we're gonna refocus this internally. It might produce a less productive America. It might produce, it might cut, the economic life out of cities and out of the service industry. But this is fundamentally what we want to do, and we're okay with that.
Right. With Trump's renewed disengagement from WTO norms, do you see this as a terminal moment for the post-war liberal trade order, or is there still a path to restoration? What lessons can be drawn from the Trump era about the vulnerability of international economic governance to populist subversion, and what reforms are needed to future-proof institutions like the WTO from nationalist retrenchment?
As a Canadian, I think about this all the time, and to be honest, I think there's a lot to be thinking about. So my first assumption is that the Trump administration is just a symptom. So you're still going to see retrenchment from free trade, and even if in 2028 you would have like a new president, I don't think this kind of protectionist will go away. So I think a lot of the international institutions will have a hard time surviving that kind of system. As a Canadian, what I'm seeing a little bit is that maybe some countries will keep those institutions alive, and at least will reduce the size of these multinational corporation. My sense is that the future is in minilateralism, where like-minded countries who see a benefit in trading will keep those institutions alive. It won't be for the benefit of the international system. It will be really for the benefit of these countries. So I see a kind of, at the EU level, there's going to be a lot more deepening of the EU kind of policies, and I don't see this going away unless a far-right government comes into France or somewhere that kind of really undo the EU institutions. I see countries like Canada wanting more trade and better relationship with those institutions, but I see the world, at least in the next couple of years, being a lot smaller than it used to be. I don't think governments will be able to replace the United States. Like the Canadian Prime Minister recently said, like, if the Americans don't want to lead, Canada will lead. But let's be honest, no one can replace the United States from a resource perspective. Maybe what we're going to see is a lot more Chinese and Russian and Iranian involvement into those institutions. The Chinese, for example, are very active at the international level. But when you listen to what they want to construct as an international system, it's a lot different than what the Americans were promoting and what allies were promoting. So my assumption is deep-seated transformation um, into the world, with a smaller world, with blocks of countries kind of trying to, defend themselves and try to promote their values, um, and a less open society at the international level. In the end, I think it's going to be the countries in Africa, in Latin America, and elsewhere that will suffer the most from it, because they were somehow the ones benefiting a lot from those openness and those multilateral institutions. Wealthy countries can provide a lot of the services and information gathering that they were doing. It was harder if you were a small country from Africa, and you were benefited a lot from the work of these multinational institutions. Um, I think I'm a pessimist in this, and I think the world will be smaller and less open.
And lastly, Professor Boucher, how should policymakers in Canada respond to the dual threat of economic harm and normative erosion posed by populist-driven trade wars? What counter-narratives can be mobilized to restore public trust in multilateralism?
Even in Canada, I'd say the let's say there was this movement in Canada a long time ago, not a long time ago, like when I was doing my PhD, that argued that like these multinational, like multilateralism was a practice more so than a belief. That what was good was, practicing multilateralism as not as an end, but as a means of things. If you look at like the work of Vincent Pouliot and all this practice theory in international relations, really made this argument that the point of multilateralism was not the end or the kinds of things that we would get from multilateralism. It was more an activity. I don't think that's true anymore, even in Canada. I think even Canadians now are less and less devoted to multilateralism as a principle, and are looking for more and more ways to promote their views. Like the way we see this in Canada is that the world is retrenching, and somehow it's getting smaller, and somehow we have to refocus our attention a little bit more. And especially in like the rise of China and Russia kind of showed how these multilateral institutions had a difficulty kind of adjusting to it. Now that the United States have kind of joined the bandwagon on this front, really kind of begs the reason that those institutions won't survive in their present form. And so a lot of the foreign policy from the Canadian perspective is moving away from from a really kind of a lot of actions within those multilateral institutions, and into more bilateral relationship. So, for example, if you look at what Canada is doing, um, we are, trying to deepen our relationship with key European partners in Brussels, but also in Paris and London, in Berlin, and really kind of increasing our engagement and our integration with those arguments. There's a lot of talks in Canada about Canada joining the European Union, which, to be honest, um, might like if you did a referendum today in Canada, it would probably fly, and people would actually be like, yeah, we're going to join the European Union. That makes sense for us. And so we're seeing a lot of that pool. Recently, we also published a document formalizing our policy toward the Indo-Pacific. And if you look at what the government of Canada is doing, is right now going into the Pacific and increasing its relationship with key partners in the Pacific. So you see a lot of people going to Japan, Taiwan, South Korea, Australia, and kind of deepen their ties with those institutions. We have a refocus on ASEAN and try to kind of increase those relationships. So we're moving away maybe from these big international institutions and going like smaller into those regional mini-lateral institutions, and kind of pushing a lot of our relationship in those environments, because it's just easier, and the commitment to shared values is the conversation is just a better one than what we have at the let's say at the global level.
Right. Professor Jean-Christophe Boucher, thank you so much for your time. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much.
May I kindly ask a picture of yours, Professor, to use in the interview?
Sure.
Can you
I
send
mean,
it to
it was like wobbly a little bit. It's like very early in the morning.
No, I think it was quite okay.
Okay. You should see. So I wrote a paper that you might like in International Studies Quarterly that look at it's called like Transnationalism and Populism in ISQ, and looks at the Freedom Convoy and far right networks, populist networks on social media. So essentially, the argument is like right now we really talked about more like how the ideational populism can change foreign policy behaviors. But in that context, we were looking more at networks of populist movements, right? So there's all this kind of really interesting work on how populist leaders across the world create these networks. And I think that's a key in understanding populist foreign policy, you know, Trump going to Orban and Orban going to Le Pen, and all of those populist leaders engaging a lot in those relationships. What we were looking for is more people to people relationship, populist people to populist people relationship, and how influencers in Canada and influencers in the US shared a lot of those conversations to kind of help each other out. And I find this interesting because it speaks to foreign policy, it speaks to international relations, and how these populist movement are able to move across the world from one country to the other. And you know, the Canadian populists are like, you hate the elites, and the French populists are like, I hate the elites too. And somehow they're like connecting and they're creating these networks. And what's interesting is that those networks also share information, they share resources, they share kind of strategies, and so that's kind of important too, right? That you saw the Gilets jaunes, manifestation in France, kind of going away elsewhere in the world, and in the case in Canada, you saw the Freedom Convoy in Canada being supported by this network of populist leaders and influencers across the world. And so there's this kind of like really weird, you know, deepening of like ethno-nationalist populism, where the populists kind of want to kind of create this kind of pure and national, and reducing the nation to the people, and kind of blurring those two elements. But there's also this argument that through populism ideology, you can actually share beliefs with other groups, the same way that you could have with like socialism, where, you know, the Russians would say like, well, a communist is a communist is a communist, and, you know, yes, I can have a Russian view of communism, but if I go to Latin America, I can have like, or Cuba, I can have relationships with the Cuban, and shared ideas allows us to communicate better with each other. Anyway, it's interesting, I think.
It is interesting indeed. Thank you again.